Okay, I wanted to take a couple minutes to sort of explain, being that it's IEP season, and I'm not one to sort of recognize this. Guys, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to recognize this new normal and fall into that trap. All right, so I'm plowing forward. It's a dangerous game if we accept that manipulation um, from the various institutions that for whatever reason, I'm not going to get into that. But guys, our normal, it needs to remain our normal. All right. The education secretary provided that opportunity, and we need to seize it, being that she's not going to expand and create a new normal, meaning waivers and exceptions um, to the schools on providing special education services or recognizing disability rights like under 504. All right, that's a positive. So let's seize on that and plan and chart and push for returning to normal, not going to a new normal where this virus upends and supersedes our lives and our thinking, because it flies in the face of common sense and reason, guys. And I don't play that game very well. All right, so what I wanted to talk about was least restrictive environment. And least restrictive environment is always determined at the end of your IEP meeting, not at any point before. Cannot be discussed before, can't be discussed in the middle. Least restrictive environment, or the placement of your child, which is where that IEP that you just developed can be implemented. Now, why don't you do that? Well, it's called predetermination, and you cannot predetermine where a child is going to go, and you don't craft the IEP because everybody wants, or the school system wants the child to go to this particular location. Inappropriate. You don't do that. You look at the child's needs based upon the profile that's put together, and it's put together and charted in a very specific way. You include the strengths of the child. You include the parental concerns and the parental input. You include the most recent evaluations and present level of performance, the baselines, where the child's currently functioning. And off of that, then you determine whether the child needs a behavior plan, whether the child can function without adult support in non-academic settings, meaning the hallways and in other aspects of the school campus. You develop the goals, you develop the services. Then you develop the supplemental aids and services. What additional accommodations does a child require? Once you put all that together, that provides a very, very clear snapshot to the IEP team on where that child can be served. Okay? Now, there's a difference between location and placement. And that's a very complicated legal term in special education. But they're both part of least restrictive environment. Okay? So placement is, let's say, where that IEP can be implemented. And typically it can be in the same school as, so one aspect is going to be sort of the broader, location being the school. Placement is where inside, let's say, this particular classroom or a hybrid of different locations. This is where that IEP that we just developed can be implemented. Okay, so under least restrictive environment, and I'm referring to the federal IDEA. Okay, so you're going to have to look at your state regulations, but every state, at a minimum, must follow these rules that I'm citing. The only thing that states can do is enhance those rules and make them better than what I'm about to explain. Okay, but we're going to start at what least restrictive environment means, and I'm going to provide a copy of what I'm referring to so that you can see for yourself. But the state must have, in effect, policies and procedures to ensure that public agencies in the state meet the LRE requirements of this section, and it provides you what section is talking about, all the way to 300.120. All right, so each public agency, meaning the public schools, must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. Meaning don't have IEPs. Okay? Now, the word maximum extent, there's a couple places within the law that exists. On the whole, schools view the IDEA from a minimalistic standpoint, and a lot of that tracks back to the Supreme Court decision, the Raleigh decision. Now, we since traded that out for the Andrew F. Supreme Court guidance, and so if you were to take that guidance and insert it to that phrase, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in, are educated with children who are non-disabled. Now, in Andrew F., this says maximum extent appropriate. Andrew F. adds that caveat to where your child's entitled to a free and appropriate public education in light of the child's circumstances. So in light of the child's circumstances is going to be that phrase that then gets meshed into this idea of to the maximum extent appropriate, your child needs to be involved and educated with children that are non-disabled. All right, so keep those things in mind. In light of the child's circumstances to the maximum extent appropriate, they're sort of the same concept. And so that's where on an individualized level, there needs to be an analysis of the child's functioning levels and their abilities. Okay? But that's still the standard. Now, what would impact maximum extent appropriate? Well, obviously behavior. Behavior would impact or impede your child's learning or the learning of others. So it's that learning of others, but also impeding their own learning that is one of those mechanisms that dilute that maximum extent appropriate. My child's one of those. I mean, she just isn't a general education type of student, and we understand that. Her needs need to be delivered in a different way. If you have a child that, and understand that there needs to be an exhaustion component before a school system has the justification and the data to make a determination that they cannot feasibly do it to the maximum extent appropriate, and that's where a behavior plan comes in. Okay, and there's got to be sufficient time to justify that they've sort of exhausted in that area. Now, the schools are allowed to create special classes, separate schools, other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education occurring only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplemental aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. All right, so we have maximum extent. Now we have their ability to, along the continuum. And if you see down on 300.115, we have that term. And if you've watched enough of my video, you hear me referring to the continuum of alternative placements. Now that's what that is. You have least restrictive environment, okay? And you just look at it like a straight line, with general education being here. And that's general education with no IEP, because that's the goal. That's the goal of every child with an IEP, is to work toward not needing an IEP, not needing accommodations, not needing additional supports. That's the goal. So your child has an IEP, and so you start here on that continuum, which is that straight line. And so there's your maximum extent appropriate, but let's say your child, because of, in light of their circumstances or other components with regards to the nature or severity of their disability, which would be in light of their circumstances, can't be appropriately served in that environment. And then through the development of the IEP, it became clear that that was the case. So at that point, you move down on that continuum, or you know, it's not down, it's across that line to the point where that continuum, your child is about here, okay? Now this thing continues all the way over to being in a, let's say, an institution, even that could be even out of state, that is along that continuum of alternative placements. Homebound, is right here. A self-contained environment, a child that is in resource and general education. So you see how they plot all the way across that continuum to the maximum extent appropriate, where to look at general education. And then we need to also gauge the nature of the severity of the disability. Now, what is severity of the disability? Like I said, that's behavior. There's only two ways to keep a kid out of general education. Only two. I'm trying to think. Yeah. Behavior is one of them. And the other one is severely cognitively disabled. Now you go, okay, well, what is severely cognitively disabled? Typically, that means that your child has an IQ or a cognitive test indicating that they are scoring at 55 or below. Now, there's a lot of, it's an imperfect evaluation, that IQ measure, and there's a lot of caution that you need to engage in scrutiny, and to anything like that, depending on the nature of your child's disability. The IQ measure just isn't appropriate, and can produce false positives and inaccurate results. Okay, but that is typically the marker, 55 or below. So if you have a child that, let's say, is scoring for intellectual disability, let's say in the state of Alabama, and actually most states, that threshold is below a 70. So 69 or below would be the start of intellectual disability. Now, if your child's in a self-contained environment, and let's say they have a 69 or a 65 IQ measure, and the school has them in a self-contained environment, and your child doesn't have any behaviors, because they really shouldn't be doing that. Why? Because the LRE requirements state that to the maximum extent appropriate. Now, at the same time, if I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be some hybrid, more of a mix. I think that would be appropriate. Then at that point, you have that exposure with general education peers, and exposure to the curriculum that is scaffolded. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you can do to make that environment appropriate. All right. But then also that resource time that they need for that individualized instruction. So that would be on that continuum of alternative placements, a spot that you would need to look at. But to have schools just sort of make these arbitrary decisions that, we're going to send this kid to, because the curriculum, it's fast paced now, and we want to be kind and nice. No. No. But how do you keep your eye open for that kind of effect? It's all in how they're designing your IEP. So if you get good at sort of understanding that you've got to put the IEP together before you determine where that IEP is going to be implemented, and I'm talking about which particular class or a hybrid of classes, well, then you can sit there and watch where you're going. I mean, when you're walking and hiking, you can see the mountain in the distance. This is no different. If you open your eyes, you can see the direction the IEP team is taking your child. You just got to be aware of what that means. We're putting the IEP together, then we're determining where that IEP can be implemented. So if they're putting in a lot of services, a lot of goals, and they're sitting there saying, oh, we need all this time and resource or special education to work on these things for your child. A free and appropriate public education is a minimal standard. And if they sit there and they say, well, we need your time, we need your child for all this extra stuff. Well, guys, this is where you come in and you sit there and you have to balance what's the greater benefit to your child, and what can they do to minimize pull-out services and push those services into the general education environment? What can be done? And there's many instances where allergy season. There's many instances to where that can happen and push those services into general education instead of pulling your child out, which is more restrictive. So you just got to get creative to do that. I had a case to where they wanted to pull my client out to work on social skills in the self-contained classroom. And of course, my query was, why would you work on social skills individually with the child when you can plan that as a push-in service so that you have the child exposed to neurotypical peers and you're using the opportunity to model and to instruct the child right there and guide the child in socialization opportunities? That would be a push-in service. So what ended up happening is, because of how it was notated in the IEP, now all of a sudden we were able to move those special education minutes to a general education setting instead of as a pull-out service, which then impacted the percentage calculations of how much time was outside of general education. Because that's where your least restrictive environment calculations are impacted, is how much of those services are being required as a pull-out services outside of general education. If the services are pushed into general ed, then it doesn't impact that least restrictive environment with regards to moving your child down that continuum to something more restrictive. Let's see. Okay, so on placements, and keep this in mind because we had a case about this. The IEP team, if your child has an IEP, including preschool children with a disability, the IEP team must make a placement decision. So in some of our cases where we've had preschool children that are, let's say, not offered a preschool program inside the school and are told, well, go to a Mother's Day out or go to a private preschool. Guys, that's not how this works. It needs to be an IEP team decision even for a preschool child. And it needs to be a free and appropriate public education. And there's way too many schools that are freeloading off of parents and not doing their due diligence or what's appropriate under the law because they claim that they don't have enough preschool funding. Well, for example, the state of Alabama basically single-handedly destroyed the existing preschool apparatus because they were clamoring for all that grant money and free money attached to the state's new preschool program, mainly developed for neurotypical kids and non-IEP kids, known as first class preschool. And that's by a lottery system, which of course is not discriminatory because kids with disabilities can apply. They just might not be selected. So what ended up happening is a lot of the schools were trashing their preschool programs in order to get that grant money from the state instead of having to pay out of their own account for those preschool programs that were a hybrid of neurotypical kids and kids with IEPs. As you can see here, they can't do that. Placement decisions must be made by the IEP team, and it still needs to meet that standard of a free and appropriate public education. And is made in conformity with the LRE provisions in the subpart and is determined at least annually, is based on the child's IEP, like I had said, is as close as possible to the child's home. Okay? Unless the IEP of the child with a disability requires some other arrangement, the child is to be educated in the school that he or she would attend if non-disabled. So as close as possible to child's home and in the school that the child's zoned for if the child was not disabled. Now, there's some additional complexities there where schools are abusing that process by abusing an aspect of the law that allows them to concentrate resources and then house them at particular schools and then force your child to have to attend that particular program to where it's a specialized program, it's a specialized class. So you saw in the earlier section to where they can create special classes and things like that, but it typically needs to be just for low incident or low occurring disabilities. Now, what would that definition be? That's where there's a lot of gray area, and that's where a lot of the schools have been abusing those rules on what a low occurring or a low incident disability would be. And, you know, they're finding that as a mechanism to sit there and corral all the autistic kids over here and all of the multiple disability need kids over at this different school. And in some ways, if you do a proper analysis, it could be a violation of the LRE placement section based upon those rules. But like I said, you would need somebody like me to sit there and look at everything, look at the IEP, look at how the IEP was developed to make that or help you make that determination on whether or not it was a violation or whether it was appropriate. In some cases, it is appropriate because schools are allowed to concentrate resources in a narrow scope, okay? Now, E is important, okay? A child with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because of needed modifications in a general education curriculum. What does that mean? That means if your child's 4 grade levels behind and your child doesn't have behaviors that impede their learning or the learning of others, meaning they're not disruptive, and let's say that they're even on the extended standards or the alternative pathway, you don't remove them from their education environment with age-appropriate peers solely because they're that far behind. You can modify the general education curriculum in order to make their learning experience individualized within the environment to the maximum extent appropriate is beneficial to them. There's multiple reasons why general education is appropriate for children. And on an equity standpoint, if this child isn't causing any issues with regards to behavioral disruptions, then modifying their curriculum so that they receive other benefits. Well, what are the other benefits? Well, there's 2 other educational performance prongs. There's communication with age-appropriate neurotypical peers, and then there's the social-emotional aspect, the social-emotional development aspect that is so critical for modeling appropriate behavior and modeling those. And the benefit also goes the other way. Guys, our entire education system is a therapeutic setting for all children because we're preparing them to live in our civil society. So our neurotypical kids need to be exposed to our special education and our disabled kids. They need that exposure just as much as our kids need theirs. It is a quid pro quo. There is a reciprocal benefit. And so as you can see here, that they can modify the curriculum and they're mandated to do it. And the child is not to be removed just because they need modifications to the general education curriculum. That's huge. All right. Non-academic settings. Now, what is that? That's non-academic would be anything outside of an instructional classroom. Extracurricular services and activities. That includes meals, recess, services and activities set forth in 300.107. You can scroll up to look at that as. Each public agency must ensure that each child with a disability participates with non-disabled children the extracurricular services and activities to the maximum extent appropriate, there you go again, to the needs of the child, must ensure that each child with a disability has the supplementary aids and services determined by the team to be appropriate and necessary. So if your child in non-academic and extracurricular activities needs an aid in order to benefit, then that's exactly what is needed. If they need accommodations, that's exactly what's needed. That's non-academic settings, extracurricular activities. Those things need to be part of that analysis and part of the IEP team determination. They can't just sit there and say, well, your kid can't be an extracurricular. They can't go on field trips unless you go. There you go, guys. Non-academic settings. They can't do that. I'm going to skip by technical assistance and training. This is interesting because each state education agency, that's the SEA, must carry out activities to ensure that teachers and administrators in the public agencies, meaning the local schools, are fully informed about the responsibilities for implementing the law, are provided with technical assistance and training necessary to assist them in this effort. Guys, the state education agency can be sued for failing to comply with their responsibilities to train the teachers and train the administrators appropriately in implementing this law. That is their responsibility. That's where that comes in, guys. They also must carry out activities to ensure that this law is implemented by each school system and that there is evidence that the school is making placements that are inconsistent. There's evidence. If there is evidence there's evidence that the public agency, meaning the local school, is making placements that are inconsistent with the LRE law, then the state agency must review the public agency's justifications for its actions. So let's say that they have a standalone special education school that has no general education kids in it at all. That would be one of those things that would be inconsistent with the LRE. And they would need to provide the state agency a justification on why they have that school even in existence. And I think they'd be hard pressed to be able to explain that, quite frankly. Assistant plan, they get away with it though, because there's many standalone special education only schools that have no exposure to general education whatsoever. Assist in planning and implementing any necessary corrective action. That's the state's responsibility, those two things. So that's what I wanted to go over real quick with regards to what least restrictive environment is and how you can do that analysis yourself so that you have a better understanding when you're developing the IEP from the beginning, that we wait until the end to determine where that IEP that you just developed can be implemented. And if you want to try to move your child out of a more restrictive setting into a least restrictive setting and more general education, then where you need to fight your battle is where that IEP is developed, where those service minutes are being implemented, what supplemental aids and services can be provided. And then at the end, that's when you make your argument that, hey, this IEP that we just developed can be implemented in a hybrid situation or through push-in services. You don't wait and let them develop this IEP and walk you down the path, because now you're at the mountain and it's right here. Instead of way back there when you had perspective and you had the ability to sit there and take some direction over the direction you were going. It does take practice, guys. But that is the nuts and bolts of least restrictive environment.